The white orchid corsage lay pressed between sheets of archival tissue in evidence box 94 to 127, its petals brittle as parchment after 30 years in storage. Detective Sarah Chen lifted the plastic container with careful hands, studying the delicate flower that had somehow survived 3 decades while its wearer had not. The preservation was remarkable. Each petal still held traces of its original cream color, and the pearl-headed pin that had once secured it to a prom dress remained untarnished. "You really think this thing can tell us anything new?" Detective Mike Torres asked from his desk across the cramped office of the Alameda County Cold Case Unit. Rain streaked the windows of their Oakland headquarters, the February storm matching the gray mood that had settled over the department since budget cuts had reduced their team to just 2 investigators. Sarah turned the evidence container slowly, examining the corsage from every angle. The preservation method is unusual. Most flowers from 1994 would be dust by now, but this one was treated with something glycerin maybe, or a professional preservation compound. That suggests planning. Forethought. The case file spread across her desk told a story that had haunted the Bay Area for 3 decades. Melissa Hartley, 18 years old, had vanished on prom night, May 14, 1994, after leaving the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco with her date, Brandon Kessler. Her body had been found 6 weeks later in the Berkeley Hills, but the case had gone cold when Brandon died in a car accident just days before he was scheduled for a polygraph test. Sarah had inherited the case from Detective Frank Morrison, who had worked it obsessively for 15 years before retiring in defeat. His parting words still echoed in her mind. "That girl deserves justice, Chen. She was going places. Berkeley pre-law, full scholarship, the whole world ahead of her. Someone took that away, and they're still out there." The crime scene photos showed Melissa's remains discovered by hikers near Tilden Park, her prom dress still recognizable despite months of exposure to the elements. But the corsage had been found separately, carefully wrapped in plastic and hidden beneath a pile of stones nearly a mile from where the body was located. The preservation, the deliberate concealment, it suggested the killer had kept it as a trophy before disposing of it. Sarah opened her laptop and pulled up the original case files, digitized just 2 years earlier as part of the department's modernization effort. The investigation had focused heavily on Brandon Kessler, Melissa's prom date, and the last person known to have seen her alive. He was 19, a Berkeley student from a wealthy Marin County family, with no prior criminal record but a reputation for heavy drinking and aggressive behavior when intoxicated. According to witness statements from the prom, Brandon and Melissa had argued during dinner at the hotel. Other students reported seeing them leave together around 11 p.m., but their accounts varied about whether Melissa had gone willingly or appeared distressed. Brandon's story was that he had dropped her off at her family's home in Oakland around midnight, but Melissa's parents insisted she had never come home. The phone on Sarah's desk rang, interrupting her review of the files. The caller ID showed Redwood City Police Department. "Detective Chen? This is Officer Janet Russell in Redwood City. We've got a situation here that might connect to one of your cold cases. A woman named Patricia Vance just walked into our station claiming she killed someone 30 years ago." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Can you give me details?" She's asking specifically about the Melissa Hartley case from 1994. Says she's been carrying the guilt for 3 decades and can't live with it anymore. She mentioned something about a corsage. Within 2 hours, Sarah was driving south on Highway 101 toward Redwood City, her mind racing with possibilities. Patricia Vance wasn't a name that appeared anywhere in the original case files, which meant either the 1994 investigation had missed something crucial, or they were dealing with a false confession from someone seeking attention. The Redwood City Police Station was a modern building surrounded by tech company offices, the heart of Silicon Valley sprawling in all directions. Officer Russell met Sarah in the lobby, a young woman with serious eyes and the careful demeanor of someone handling her first major case. She's been sitting in interview room 2 for the past hour, just staring at her hands, Russell explained as they walked down a fluorescent-lit corridor. "Won't talk to anyone except the detective handling the Hartley case. Says she has information about the corsage that only the killer would know." Through the one-way mirror, Sarah studied Patricia Vance. She was a woman in her late 40s, professionally dressed in a navy blazer and pearls, her graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for a cup of coffee, and dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't slept in days. Sarah entered the interview room and took a seat across from Patricia, placing a digital recorder on the table between them. "Miss Vance, I'm Detective Chen from Alameda County. I understand you have information about the Melissa Hartley case." Patricia looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. "I killed her. It was an accident, but I killed her, and I've been living with it for 30 years. I need you to understand your rights before we continue, Sarah began, but Patricia waved her hand dismissively. I've already spoken to a lawyer. I know exactly what I'm doing. I want to tell you what happened that night, all of it. Sarah read the Miranda warning anyway, waiting for Patricia's verbal acknowledgement before proceeding. Tell me about your connection to Melissa Hartley. There was no connection, not really. That's what made it so senseless. Patricia's voice was steady now, as if she had rehearsed this confession countless times. I was 22 in 1994, working as event coordinator at the Fairmont Hotel. It was my first real job after college, and I was desperate to succeed. She paused, gathering her thoughts. The prom was one of our biggest events that spring. Hundreds of kids. Their parents spending thousands of dollars on what was supposed to be the perfect night. I was responsible for making sure everything went smoothly. Sarah listened without interrupting, noting the specific details that suggested Patricia was telling the truth. The woman knew about the hotel layout, the timing of events, details that hadn't been released to the public. Around 11:30, I was doing a final check of the ballroom when I saw her, Melissa standing alone near the service entrance. She looked upset, mascara running down her cheeks. Her date was nowhere to be seen, and she was trying to call someone on her cell phone. Patricia described approaching Melissa, offering help, learning that Brandon had gotten drunk and belligerent during dinner. Melissa had slapped him when he became inappropriate with her, and he had stormed off, leaving her stranded at the hotel without a ride home. I offered to drive her. It seemed like the right thing to do. She was just a kid, and it was late. She was hesitant at first, but I showed her my hotel ID, convinced her I was safe. Patricia's voice cracked. If only she had called a cab instead. The drive had started normally, Patricia explained. They talked about Melissa's plans for college, her excitement about studying law, her dreams of becoming a prosecutor. But somewhere on the winding road through the Berkeley Hills, Patricia had made a mistake that changed everything. I was exhausted. I'd been working 16-hour days preparing for prom season. I nodded off at the wheel for just a second, but that was enough. The car went off the road and hit a tree. Sarah leaned forward. What happened to Melissa? She hit her head on the passenger window. There was so much blood and she wasn't responding. I checked for a pulse, tried CPR, everything I could think of, but Patricia broke down, sobbing into her hands. She was gone. This beautiful, brilliant girl was dead because I fell asleep driving. The story that emerged over the next hour was one of panic, poor decisions, and mounting desperation. Patricia, terrified of losing her job and facing vehicular manslaughter charges, had moved Melissa's body to a location far from the crash site. She had damaged her own car to make it look like she had hit a deer, a story that had satisfied both her insurance company and the police, who filed a routine accident report. But I couldn't leave her there like that, exposed to the elements. She deserved better. Patricia pulled a tissue from her purse, wiping her eyes. I went back 3 times over the next few weeks, trying to find a way to give her a proper burial without exposing what I had done. What about the corsage? Sarah asked. Patricia's expression grew distant, haunted. She was wearing it when she died. This beautiful white orchid probably cost her date $50. When I moved her body, it fell off, and I couldn't bear to leave it behind. She had been so excited about prom, so happy despite everything that had gone wrong with her date. Sarah felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. You preserved it. I worked part-time at a flower shop during college. I knew how to treat flowers to make them last. I thought maybe someday I would find a way to return it to her family, but as the years went by, it became evidence of what I had done. I was too afraid to get rid of it, too guilty to keep it. The confession continued for another 2 hours, Patricia providing details about the crash site, the method she had used to preserve the corsage, and the location where she had ultimately hidden it. Every detail matched the physical evidence, answering questions that had puzzled investigators for 3 decades. Why now? Sarah asked finally. Why come forward after 30 years? Patricia stared at her hands, the weight of decades pressing down on her shoulders. I have a daughter. She's 18 now, graduating from high school in 2 months. When I look at her, all I can see is Melissa at that age, so full of hope, so ready to change the world. I realized I've been stealing that girl's justice for 30 years, and I can't do it anymore. The drive back to Oakland gave Sarah time to process what she had learned. Patricia Vance's confession had solved the mystery of Melissa Hartley's death, but it had also revealed the tragic irony at the heart of the case. For 3 decades, investigators had pursued Brandon Kessler as their prime suspect, convinced that his death in a car accident had cheated justice. In reality, Melissa had died in another car accident entirely, the victim of a tired young woman's momentary lapse of attention. Sarah's first call was to Diane Hartley, Melissa's mother, who still lived in the same Oakland house where she had waited in vain for her daughter to come home from prom 30 years earlier. The conversation was one of the most difficult of Sarah's career. An accident? Diane's voice was barely a whisper over the phone. All these years, I thought someone had murdered my baby, and it was just an accident? Sarah chose her words carefully. Mrs. Hartley, I know this is difficult to process. Ms. Vance made some terrible decisions after the crash, but the initial incident wasn't intentional. She let us suffer for 30 years, thinking our daughter had been murdered. She let that boy's family live with suspicion and blame. Diane's voice grew stronger, anger replacing shock. That's not an accident, detective. That's a choice. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and emotionally charged. Patricia Vance was charged with vehicular manslaughter, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. Her lawyer argued for leniency based on her voluntary confession and the decades of guilt she had endured, but the prosecution pressed for prison time, emphasizing the additional trauma caused by her cover-up. The case attracted significant media attention, particularly when details emerged about Brandon Kessler's death. His family had lived under a cloud of suspicion for 30 years, with many in the community convinced he had killed Melissa and escaped justice through his own accidental death. Brandon's younger sister, now a successful attorney in Los Angeles, filed a civil suit against Patricia Vance for defamation and emotional distress. My brother died believing people thought he was a murderer, Jennifer Kessler told reporters outside the courthouse. Our family has carried that burden for 3 decades, and now we learn it was all based on one woman's selfish decision to save herself. Sarah found herself caught between sympathy for all the families involved and frustration with the waste of it all. If Patricia had simply called 911 after the accident, Melissa might have survived, or at least her family would have had closure immediately. Instead, 3 families had been destroyed by fear and poor decisions. The Corsage remained in evidence storage, its preservation now serving as a symbol of both love and guilt. Patricia had maintained it carefully for 30 years, she claimed, because she couldn't bear to let it deteriorate. It was the last beautiful thing associated with Melissa's life. But Sarah suspected it was also Patricia's way of keeping the crime alive in her conscience, ensuring she could never completely forget what she had done. During Patricia's sentencing hearing, Diane Hartley chose to address the court. She was a woman in her 70s now, her hair silver, her face lined with decades of grief. But her voice was strong as she faced the woman who had stolen 30 years of her family's peace. I want you to understand what you took from us, Diane said, her eyes fixed on Patricia. You didn't just take Melissa's life. You took our ability to mourn her properly. You let us imagine the worst possible scenarios, let us wonder if she suffered, if she was afraid. You turned our grief into a nightmare that lasted 3 decades. Patricia wept as she listened, her own daughter sitting in the gallery with her father. Sarah watched the girl blonde and 18, her whole life ahead of her, and wondered what it felt like to discover your mother was capable of such sustained deception. But Diane wasn't finished. However, I also want to acknowledge that you cared for that corsage all these years. In your own twisted way, you honored my daughter's memory. That doesn't excuse what you did, but it tells me you're not a monster, just a person who made terrible choices. Patricia received a sentence of 8 years in prison, with a possibility of parole in 5. The judge cited her voluntary confession and apparent remorse, while emphasizing the serious nature of her crimes and their impact on multiple families. As she was led away in handcuffs, Patricia turned to look at Diane Hartley one last time. I'm sorry, she mouthed, and Diane nodded slightly in acknowledgement. The case officially closed with Patricia's conviction, but its effects continued to ripple through the community. The Oakland Tribune ran a series of articles about cold cases and the importance of coming forward with information, no matter how much time had passed. Several other families with missing loved ones contacted the police, hoping their cases might also find resolution. Sarah kept a photograph of the preserved corsage on her desk, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of how small decisions could have enormous consequences. She thought often about that night in 1994. Patricia falling asleep at the wheel, Brandon leaving Melissa stranded at the hotel, Melissa choosing to accept a ride from a stranger. Any one of those moments could have gone differently, and a brilliant young woman might have lived to become the prosecutor she dreamed of being. 6 months after Patricia's sentencing, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Jennifer Kessler, Brandon's sister, came to the office carrying a manila envelope filled with photographs and documents. I wanted to thank you for solving the case, Jennifer said, taking a seat across from Sarah's desk. My family can finally stop living under that shadow. She opened the envelope and spread its contents across the desk. High school yearbook photos showed Brandon as a typical teenager, handsome, athletic, smiling in his varsity football uniform. There were report cards showing solid grades, college acceptance letters, and character references from teachers and coaches. Brandon wasn't perfect, Jennifer continued. He did drink too much sometimes, and he could be arrogant. But he wasn't a killer. When he died in that car accident in 1994, he was coming back from visiting Melissa's grave. He blamed himself for leaving her at the hotel, even though he didn't know what had happened to her. Sarah studied the photographs, seeing the young man who had carried undeserved guilt to his own grave. I'm sorry your family went through that. The thing is, I think Brandon knew people suspected him. He became withdrawn after Melissa disappeared, stopped hanging out with friends, dropped out of Berkeley. The car accident that killed him, the police said he wasn't wearing his seatbelt, wasn't speeding, just seemed to lose control on a straight stretch of road. Jennifer's voice dropped to a whisper. I've always wondered if it really was an accident. The implications hung heavy in the air. Sarah had seen it before. Innocent people destroyed by suspicion, by the weight of community judgment. Brandon Kessler might have died believing he was responsible for Melissa's disappearance, never knowing that his worst crime was leaving his prom date without a ride home. Your brother didn't deserve what happened to him, Sarah said finally. I hope this brings your family some peace. Jennifer gathered up the photographs, returning them to the envelope. It does, and I hope it brings the Hartley family peace, too. Melissa deserved better than what happened to her, but at least now everyone knows the truth. After Jennifer left, Sarah sat in her office as evening shadows lengthened across Oakland. The Corsage evidence box sat on her filing cabinet, no longer needed for prosecution but somehow too significant to simply dispose of. She had called the funeral home that handled Melissa's burial, asking if they could properly enter the corsage with the rest of her remains. The funeral director, a gentleman named Robert Chin, no relation, had been moved by the request. 30 years later, she gets her corsage back, he had said. There's something beautiful about that. Despite everything, the ceremony took place on a sunny morning in May, almost exactly 30 years after Melissa's death. Her parents were there, along with a few high school friends who had never forgotten their classmate. Patricia Vance was serving her sentence and couldn't attend, but she had written a letter that Diane Hartley chose to read aloud. To Melissa's family and friends, Diane read, her voice steady in a quiet cemetery. I know my apologies can never undo the pain I've caused, but I want you to know that I thought of Melissa every day for 30 years. She was kind to me that night, even though she was upset and scared. She talked about her dreams, her plans to help people through the law. I'm sorry I took that future away from her, and I'm sorry I made all of you suffer by hiding the truth. The preserved corsage was placed in a small casket and buried beside Melissa's headstone. As they lowered it into the ground, Sarah found herself thinking about the girl who had worn it to prom 30 years earlier, 18 years old, full of ambition and hope, looking forward to a future that would never come. But she also thought about the truth that had finally emerged, painful and complicated as it was. 3 families had found different kinds of closure. The Hartleys could finally mourn their daughter properly. The Kesslers had cleared their son's name, and Patricia Vance's family could begin to heal from the secret that had poisoned their lives. The case taught Sarah that justice wasn't always about punishment or revenge. Sometimes it was simply about truth, about bringing light to dark places and allowing people to grieve, forgive, and move forward. The Corsage had kept its secrets for 30 years, but in the end, it had told its story. And that story, tragic as it was, had set multiple families free from the prison of not knowing. As she drove away from the cemetery, Sarah thought about all the other cold cases waiting in evidence storage, all the families still searching for answers. Each case was a puzzle with human hearts at its center, and each solution brought both pain and relief. The work was difficult, often heartbreaking, but moments like this reminded her why it mattered. The corsage was finally at rest, and with it, the 30-year mystery that had haunted everyone it touched. In death, Melissa Hartley had gotten her prom corsage back, a small gesture of beauty and a story marked by tragedy. It wasn't the ending anyone would have chosen, but it was an ending nonetheless, and sometimes that was enough.